IVM.
Here's an interesting thing about Google. For a company which earns more than 90% of its revenues through advertising, yes, that's one of their mainstays of their business model, or their revenue model at least. The company itself started advertising pretty late. In fact, Larry Page and Sergey Brin, the founders of Google, were fairly anti-advertising. Now, isn't that ironic? That's a smart fact for today. And in this episode, I'm just going to try and figure out, when does one start the branding work, specifically as far as advertising or marketing is concerned? When should you start it? And I'm going to present a contrarian view towards the same. So let's go. Right. So on Smarter With Sid, the way we go about things is we try to understand the context first. Then we try to go down to first principles. Then obviously we try and do some takeaways from whatever we are trying to understand or just enjoy, and see how we can apply it for our lives. So today, what I wanted to say was, even though Google did not advertise for itself for the longest possible time, it did so on the basis of 2 or 3 core aspects. One is that it did not advertise because it was believing that word of mouth about its superior product will carry the day. It will make sure that they win. The second thing that they did was they focused on the tech segment that would have been doing this word of mouth. Thirdly, what they actually realized was perhaps branding work that Google required was not required for the people who are the early adopters and innovators, but maybe later on for the early majority who are not of this tech type. Now, that was the way in which Google looked at it. And if you look at a lot of these tech players, and specifically social media players, you will see that they didn't really start advertising themselves at the very beginning of their so-called launch or of the product or the service. Take Facebook, for example, or take Airbnb, or take anybody else. I think Amazon used to do some clever advertising, but a lot of times this behavior of these iconic brands that they have built themselves as iconic brands comes contrary to the kind of stuff that we hear about how branding should happen for any startup or any new initiative or any new launch. Now, when you start thinking on these terms, you start beginning to wonder what's right and what's wrong. Are all the agencies wrong, or are people who are marketing professionals wrong? Did Google and Facebook just become lucky, or is there a lesson to be taken over from there? If I look at a non-digital example, if I look at Patanjali, right, that famous brand that was spearheaded by Baba Ramdev and his foundation, what we do realize is a complete opposite way of doing things. So they were not actually building their products first, or whatever they may be. And I'm not talking of the quality of the product or anything of that sort. I'm steering far away from any sort of product quality discussion or conspiracy theories related to that. The only point to note over here is that they had built their brand way before they actually started putting their product out in the market. How, you ask me? Well, they built their brand in a very unconventional way. What they did was they built up Baba Ramdev as a brand, as an influencer, even before the word influencer became to be famous, right? And they did so in a very strong way. They had the Astha channel that was focusing on Baba Ramdev's yoga exploits. They focused on the Make in India movement even before that movement started. And they focused on a specific segment that was a believer in these two movements. Right? Now, there is a lesson there which is very contrarian. That is something that we can look towards understanding and perhaps even emulating if we are doing any work. Now, let's compare and contrast this to a typical startup that does its pieces of work. Okay. So when does a typical startup, or even an established company with a new product or a new initiative or new service, start its branding? First of all, 2 things that come to mind. They start their branding after their product, service, or everything is done up. Right. And now they think, okay, now we've got our stuff ready. Now let us think about marketing. And therefore, let us think about branding. That is point number 1. Point number 2 is that a lot of times we are often conflating what the rest of marketing is, which includes getting clients or converting prospects into clients, or giving incentives, giving discounts, and a plethora of marketing activity, with the science and art of branding. Branding is basically, what I mean by branding is the work that is done, required to develop the right perceptions about your product, service, or even a person, and something that will create demand, something that will create that pull for the said product or service or person in the marketplace. Now, when you're looking at all of this, right, you kind of understand that, wow, so marketing comes late in the chain, right? Marketing comes late in the chain, and it is often mistaken for conversions and sales. Now, when I look at the work of branding and the best way in which a brand is built, perhaps we have got it wrong. Perhaps we have to understand that branding work is not necessarily high cost advertising work, but it could be done in a much more simpler way by building some basic stuff out, okay, way before your product actually hits the marketplace. How can you do that? I think the core aspect that we have to understand is ask ourselves the question, who are the first people who are going to be attracted to the core value of my product? And in Google's case, they understood it was the tech guys or whatever. And you can decide for your own offering to the marketplace. The second thing is figure out how much time you have before the product hits the market. Well, you might say 3 months, 6 months, a year sometimes. And figure out, okay, so how can I build a brand before the product hits the market? Right? Because once the product hits the market and once you start communicating through a hi-fi advertising campaign and budget, it might be too late and too little. A lot of the successful brands maybe can do something else, or would be successful brands can be doing something else and emulate some of these big giants. What they can do is identify a core target segment and identify a movement or a specific interest that this core target segment may have about things. In Patanjali's case, it was yoga, and it was the Make in India movement. You got to figure out what yours is, identify these movements, and figure out how you can participate in these movements, not just on social media, but also on quasi social media, like maybe start a YouTube channel or maybe something else. But do not talk about what your great launch is or what your product is or anything. Instead, either create a movement of your own or join existing movements and become part of the conversation. In fact, if you're a person, it becomes even better, so that you can build your personal brand saying, hey, I am this wonderful AI scientist and I'm thinking of all these wonderful things. And when you do build some AI related product, well, people will take you seriously if you've done great brand building exercise for yourself on LinkedIn. So here's the contrarian view. The contrarian view is do the exact opposite of the current way in which marketing is done by the conventional companies who are about to launch a new initiative, whether it's a startup or an established company. Start building a brand right now while your product is being built around a movement, around a specific core value for a specific segment, and start building it organically. You will also not feel too much pressure. You will experiment a lot. You will find out what's working. You'll find out what's not working. You will build the whole trust and credibility factor out. And then suddenly, when you do launch your product, it will be at least appealing not just to the public at large, but certainly to the core audiences that you have built over the period of time when you have also been building your product. It also has a very good use. A lot of times we tend to avoid marketing because it's expensive, but it's quite possible to build a personal brand, or it's quite possible to build it at a B2B level or a B2C level. Personal branding, or even about a movement or a cause or on an interest, it's easier to do it. It requires effort, but not that much money. So I'm hoping that you can take this contrarian view from this episode of Smarter with Sid and have a think about it. Maybe it's not going to be useful for you. Maybe it's not something useful to you immediately, but it's always good to have more than one way of doing things in your arsenal. And that is what the premise of our podcast is, isn't it? To become smarter, right? And if you like this episode, do like and subscribe to this podcast. And hey, if you like me, I'm the traveling professor. Connect with me on LinkedIn or on Instagram, wherein I am building my brand before I bring out my rocket ship. And if you like podcasts like these, well, you always have IBM podcasts where they've got even wonderful, more varied stuff that you can dream of. Thank you so much. And until next time.
There's a quick survey to fill out on ivmpodcast.com/survey. It lets us know a little bit more about who's listening to us. And you know what? We're going to do a few prizes. So, we'll do a random drawing of maybe 10 people and we'll send you all some swag. Remember, that's ivmpodcast.com/survey where you can fill out the survey.
Hey, it's been another great week on the IVM Podcasts Network. On Think Fast, Varun and Suchita discuss Lady Gaga's brand relaunch and Patreon's creator survey. On Press Decode, Sara, Vagda and Prafula explore the mental health issues that plague our armed forces. On IVM Likes, Snehil, Antariksh Abbas and Jalasmi indulge in a friends versus How I Met Your Mother debate. On Smarter With Sid, Siddharth introduces us to the concept of dream journaling. And on Postcards from Nowhere, Utsav tells us how a 400-year-old curse, coffee and Indian Chinese food are all related. We've got some exciting news for you. IVM Podcasts has just launched its merch and our first line is out now. Head to the IVM Podcasts website and click on the shop tab to check out our first collection of t-shirts. Do follow us on social media via IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram and LinkedIn. And remember, if you're enjoying this show or any of our other shows for that matter, please do tell a friend. Don't forget to rate us on any platforms you're listening on. You can also check us out on YouTube. We are also doing a small listener survey to better understand how you respond to our shows and advertising on the network. We would really appreciate if you could spare a few minutes to fill it. It helps us build better shows for you. And finally, we would like to thank our sponsors this week: SBI Life Insurance, Jupiter, a digital banking app, and Capgemini. Get the future you want.